Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you all to the Climate Commission's community conversation here in the Latrobe Valley. The Commissioners present with us tonight, our Chief Commissioner, nationally acclaimed scientist, writer, conservationist and former Australian of the Year, Professor Tim Flannery, Professor Leslie Hughes, who's Head of the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie University, who's in fact in the middle. I'll go in order so that you can know who I'm talking about. Next, the other lady on the right-hand side, Dr. Susanna Elliott, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Science Media Centre. At the far end, Mr. Roger Beale, Executive Director of Economics and Policy at PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I've forgotten Jerry Houston in the middle, who's the recently retired President of BP Australia. The Commissioners are also joined this evening by a special guest, Professor David Carolli, who's sitting next to Tim Flannery. One of the Commissioners, Professor Will Stephan, is unable to be with us tonight, and Professor Carolli has been invited to attend as a member of the Commission's Science Advisory Panel. David's a leading expert in climate variability and climate change, including interannual climate variations due to the El Niño Southern Oscillation and weather extremes. Before we start this evening, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gunai-Kurnai people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to elders from other communities who may be here tonight joining us. My name's Rob Gell. I'm an environmental and earth scientist. I have had a career in the media, and I'm a practicing environmental communication consultant. I'm also the National President of Greening Australia, a member of the Victorian Coastal Council, and I interestingly chair a UNESCO biosphere at Western Port just across to our east. And I hope that I'll be able to facilitate this evening's discussions faithfully. The aim of tonight is very much, and I've had the pleasure of facilitating the very first Climate Commission conversation in Geelong, and they are very much designed to be a conversation. The Commissioners are here to listen as well as to share some of their knowledge and their experiences, and they've been touring around the valley just these last couple of days, and I believe are here tomorrow again. You'll hear from them on what they've heard and seen in the Latrobe Valley, and you'll also have plenty of time to ask them questions. To begin, may I introduce Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. Professor Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was named Australian of the Year in 2007 and is currently the Panasonic Chair in Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. He's had a range of academic positions. He's been the Director of the South Australian Museum. He's been Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum and the Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Welcome, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that great introduction. And I'd like to thank Gippsland campus of Monash University as well for hosting us this evening. It's really, really good to be here. In fact, it's good for me to be back in the Latrobe Valley because my very first paid job ever was at Morwell, believe it or not. I was a young student at the Museum of Victoria, and the mining operations at the Morwell coal mine had revealed some fire pits, ancient fire pits that had the skeletons of some extinct kangaroos in them. And those kangaroos happened to be what I was studying. So I was paid, I think it was $250 or something, which seemed like a fortune to me, to assist with the articulation of the skeletons that were eventually displayed in the visitors centre at the Morwell coal mine. I don't know whether they're still there, but I'd love to hear if anyone's seen them recently. It was a great experience, and they were great employers. I was very pleased to work with them. I want to just have a few words about the Climate Commission and what we do. The Climate Commission itself resulted from an election promise at the last election by the Gillard government. And we are tasked with getting out among the Australian community and entering into dialogue with people about all aspects of climate change, whether it be the science, economic issues around climate change, or what's happening internationally. We're independent of government, and we really value our independence greatly for a number of reasons. So we don't, for example, take direction from a minister, although we're funded by the government, we are independent of it. We prefer to work in a bipartisan way, and our reports that we produce periodically reflect that. The first report that we have released on the science of climate change was released in May this year into the Australian Federal Parliament, received bipartisan support from both sides, politics. Liberal and Labor Party both acknowledged that report as the basis upon which we're acting to deal with the climate problem. So we hope to work in that way as we go on. We really have three sorts of products, if you want. One is our website, and I encourage you all to go onto the website if you're interested in the work of the Commission and what we've heard around Australia, and see what you can find out there. We also have reports, as I mentioned, the science report called The Critical Decade, being our major report so far. And we also conduct community visits, and today is a good example of that. We've been around the traps today. We've been down to meet your mayor and various other councillors. We've been off to a union office here at the Hazelwood Power Station. Tomorrow we're going to a business breakfast, and we'll visit a high school and do a few other things. And of course this evening is your chance in the community to take advantage of the presence of the Commission and ask our commissioners any questions that you like. We take a long-term view of the climate issue. For us, we know that this issue will be with the Australian community for decades to come, and that in a democracy, the only way really to make progress in dealing with a problem like this is to have a populace that understands some of the key issues. So that's what we see as our role. We don't give opinions on policy, government policy or opposition policy, although we can talk about, in general, the sort of approaches that are desirable. And we do that because we give away the power to comment on policy, because we want to retain the authority to be seen as an independent source of high quality information. We don't want to get stuck into the opinion of politics. We want to provide the Australian public with the information that you require and others require in order to come to their own conclusions about the problems that we face in terms of climate change. I'd like to just turn to our commissioners now, just so you get to know them a little bit personally rather than just people on the stage, and give them just a couple of minutes each to tell their own story about why they're here and how they got interested in climate science and what they've done. And at the end of that, David Carrolly, who's sitting on my immediate left there, will begin a very brief presentation on climate science. We'll all have a word to say about that, or 3 or 4 of us will have a word to say about that, and then we'll turn the night over to you to ask questions. So bear with us for a bit longer. Soon we'll be quiet and we'll be hearing from you. But I'd like to now start with David perhaps, and could give us just a minute or two on how we got to be what he's doing today.
Sure, Tim, and it's a pleasure for me to be here in Gippsland again. I first got interested in climate science and climate variability, in fact, while skiing in the Victorian Alps, just a little bit north of here, and used to go out in the countryside and was amazed at the wind patterns and the clouds forming over the mountains. That then developed into graduate study on climate variability, and in the 1980s, mid-1980s, I started to look at climate variability and climate change. I thought I had a clever idea that would allow me, by analysing climate data, to show that increasing greenhouse gases were not causing the observed changes in the climate. And the more and more I looked at the data, I found that the patterns of observed changes were agreeing with the expected changes due to increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. My first paper on that subject was published in 1987, now 24 years ago. So I've been involved in climate science and climate variability and climate change for a number of years.
I'm Leslie Hughes. I'm an ecologist. I got interested in climate change after doing my PhD, which was actually on ant behaviour, and after following ants around the bush for about 4 years, I'd actually got a bit sick of that and was looking for something else to do. And so my PhD supervisor at the time said, you know, this was 20 years ago, climate change might be an interesting topic. And I thought, yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So I did get involved in it then, and I've been involved in it ever since, and what I've been studying is the potential impact of climate change on species and ecosystems. And what I found is that once you get into studying doing research on climate change, like David, it's very difficult to leave it alone then, because it becomes so important in your life that you can't give it away. So I guess I'm on the Commission because I've been studying climate change impacts for a very long time. The reason, however, I accepted the invitation is simply because I'm a parent, and what matters to me most is the state of the planet that I'll leave to my children.
Jerry Houston. Until recently I was head of BP in this region, and I've been an oil man for well, virtually all of my working life. I've worked with BP for nearly 35 years. So it seems a little bit incongruous that, you know, I should be here you know, talking about climate change, but many of you may or may not be aware that BP globally was one of the first big energy companies, in fact I think the first big energy company to come out and say there's a significant business risk here. You know, from what you hear from the science, this is something that we should actually look at very seriously and become part of the solution and not be part of the perceived as part of the problem. And you know, sort of the inspirational leadership from John Brown at the time meant that, you know, around the world we got engaged in the dialogue with, you know, all of the players in the game on climate change. So yeah, I've been involved in discussions with the you know, with the Howard government all the way through you know, various attempts at actually trying to address this issue from a regulatory point of view, and also involved in you know, a lot of sort of initiatives through, you know, our solar business, biofuels and things like that, that can help us lead us into a lower carbon future. So it's been something that you know, I've been heavily involved in as part of the oil industry for many years now, and this was an opportunity for me to continue that, so that actually we can try and map out a lower carbon future, you know, globally, with Australia's contribution going with it. I suppose the only other comment I'd make is that one of the flippant comments I've made in the past is that the scientists haven't spoken loud enough about the veracity of their conclusions. I now realise, in fact, they are, but they're not always listened to. But you know, I could hardly not appear with this commission with comments like that. So, so that's my story.
I'm Susanna Elliott, and I did my PhD actually on a very strange creature called a slime mould, which is a bit of a conversation stopper at parties, I used to find. And after a particularly long stint in the lab of looking down a microscope, my mother told me one day that I was starting to look like the creature that I was studying. And I thought, actually, it's probably time to get out. So, and my other main interest really at that time was communication. In fact, I was studying how these cells within this slime mould communicate with each other. So I then did postgraduate studies in journalism and became very interested in the relationship between science and scientists and the media. I then became particularly interested in climate science and more broadly environmental science while I was working in Sweden in the late 90s for about 6 years or so. And I think what was a bit of a turning point for me was when I was sitting around the dinner table one night with some very high-profile European and international group of scientists, and it was really what they couldn't talk about publicly that I found the most distressing in a way and had the most impact on me. It was one thing what they were saying in their scientific papers, what they were saying publicly and to the media, but their gut feelings. And that was not something that they were doing for any kind of fanfare or for any self-interest, but just simply talking to each other about their gut feelings. And that's what I found really had a very strong impact on me. I joined the Climate Commission because I've been working now for the Science Media Centre for some years, and in that role I'm a generalist, so I'm working in lots of different fields of science, and sometimes I'm working on, it might be vaccinations, it might be HIV, virus and treatments, it might be cancer. There are so many different things that are happening in the news media, and we're working on those issues all the time. One of the things that I found really interesting was that in most of those fields of science, there is always a small group of scientists that have a dissenting voice. And what I found particularly interesting was that in climate science, the number of dissenting voices or different opinions, if you like, is really, really very small. And yet I found that that's not really what was being reflected in the media. And so I found that really interesting, that it being one of the fields of science where consensus was really actually very, very strong in a number of different areas. That was obviously, there was a bit of a disconnect there in terms of the communication. So I joined the Climate Commission for that reason.
I'm Roger Beale, I'm the economist, and like David, I first sort of became involved in this issue in the 80s. At that stage I was running transport at the federal level, and I was pretty sceptical about this, but I've been following the science ever since, and for my sins became Environment Secretary under John Howard, helped negotiate the Kyoto Protocol, was his climate representative in international negotiations. And I just saw the science getting firmer and firmer, and I was really worried, not for myself. You'll see a slide later on which shows you why Jerry and I shouldn't be too worried about this personally, but for the kids and grandchildren. And also, I realised that this was just an area of policy that we'd grappled with but just failed to deal with as a community. And one of the reasons for that was that the community didn't understand the issue as well as it should, and in a way that would support a bipartisan approach. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the political debate. I'm interested in helping to provide the basis on which we can actually move forward together as a community that understands this is a big and important issue, and that we need to work out the best, the most efficient and the most humane way of dealing with it. So if in our own little way we can contribute to that, I'll be pleased with this last, perhaps, part of my my sort of semi-working life, if we could call it that.
So Tim's asked me, as a member of the Science Advisory Panel, to give a very brief presentation on the science of climate change. What this graph shows in a vague sort of fuzzy way is temperature variations averaged across the globe, in fact from 4 different data sets, and it's available in the Climate Commission's report, but it actually shows convincing evidence that the climate system has warmed over the last 100 years, and the multiple data sets all agree that the climate system has warmed. But we don't need to just look at global temperature data from weather observations. We can also look at the ocean data, and the ocean is also showing clear evidence of warming. And that warming has continued in the recent decade, despite what you might read in some websites that the climate system is no longer warming. In fact, the ocean holds most of the heat that's been added to the climate system, much more than the increases in temperature, and the warming has continued. There is unequivocal evidence that the climate system has warmed. It's not only in the ocean, we can also see it in the ice. And the thicker, supposedly red line on the screen that is falling away is the extent of the ice in the Arctic over the last 50 years, and it shows pronounced decreases in the extent of Arctic sea ice. The other line shows model projections of where that ice would have been in the past from 1900 to the present, and the extent projected into the future. We can see that the observations are showing that the model estimates are conservative. The observations are showing faster retreat of the sea ice in the Arctic than the models would have projected. All those observations show clear and unequivocal evidence that the climate system is warming, but they don't show what the cause is. So if we want to understand the causes, we need to look at the different factors. And we first of all have to understand the greenhouse effect, and the most important contributor to warming the climate system is sunlight from the sun. And we all know that on a sunny day like today, it's warmer than it is on a cloudy day. But the sunlight from the sun is not the only factor. It warms up the surface of the Earth, then the Earth loses heat through what's called long wave or infrared radiation out to space. Some important gases in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases, absorb some of that heat radiation and send it back to the surface of the Earth. They trap some of that heat radiation and warm up the surface of the Earth. That greenhouse effect has been known for more than 100 years. It is not new science. Since the 19th century, scientists have known about this greenhouse effect and have warned that warming due to increasing greenhouse gases from burning coal would likely cause increases in global average temperature. But we can't tell whether that increase in greenhouse gases has contributed. We can't run experiments with the real climate system, so we run experiments with climate models. And if we run climate models just with natural variations, factors like that bottom yellow disk is supposed to be the sun or volcanoes. We look at natural factors. We look at the simulations from 1900 through to 2000. That shows the range of model simulations. We can then run the same climate models run in different places around the world now with increasing greenhouse gases as well as natural factors, and with the models show a pronounced warming. We have two different sets of experiments, one without greenhouse gases, one with greenhouse gases. And we can then compare them to the observations and see which one agrees better. And what we find is that the observed temperature variations agree well with the model simulations with increasing greenhouse gases, don't agree with the model simulations just with natural variability. And that, together with a lot of other evidence, leads to the conclusion that it's in fact the increasing greenhouse gases that have been the major contributor to the warming that we've observed over the last 50 years. What it shows is one of the impacts. It shows a bell curve associated with the range of temperatures and the probability of the temperatures. What we see is that on the average conditions are the most likely, but for daily temperatures there are some cold days and some hot days. And what climate change does is adds a little bit to the temperatures. Not every day, but it shifts the distribution a little bit to the right. And what that means is that there's not a completely different distribution, but we get a higher frequency. More often we receive hot weather, and we also experience some record hot weather. And in Victoria, in February and January of 2009, we experienced new records. Here in Gippsland, in Melbourne, and throughout much of Victoria, new record high temperatures on the 9th of February. On the bottom right-hand side, that led to impacts on infrastructure, buckling of railway tracks that just could not cope with those new record high temperatures, and the railway lines had to be closed down because the trains could not operate because of the buckling in the railway lines. I'm not going to talk any more about impacts. I'm going to hand over to Leslie Hughes, who's going to talk about a range of impacts.
Thanks, Dave. So let me talk just very briefly about some of the impacts that we've already seen here in the Gippsland region and what we might expect in the future. So, over the last 100 years, temperatures in Victoria in general have increased by about 1 degree, and most of that warming has happened since the 1950s. So the warming is accelerating through time. Over that same period, we've experienced a drying right throughout southeastern Australia, and setting aside the current El Niño period, the previous warm period that you all experienced here was actually the longest and most intense drying period in the observed record. With drying and warming, there is an increased risk of fire. And while we can't attribute any particular fire event, like the Black Saturday bushfires, to human-induced climate change, what we can say with a high degree of certainty is that in the future, as the climate dries, as it warms, the conditions that are suitable for promoting intense fires will occur with greater frequency. The top picture is actually the Alps near Mount Baw. We are losing snow in Australia's alpine regions. There's a very good long-term record just across the border in New South Wales at Spencer's Creek, and it shows that there is now 40% less natural snow in springtime than there was in the 1960s. We've been losing snow at around about 10% per per decade. And obviously this has a lot of implications for the ski industry and for the alpine ecosystems. The bottom side is about coastal inundation. Sea levels are rising at about 3 millimetres per year globally. They're actually rising a little bit more slowly than that in southeastern Victoria, which is a good thing. But low-lying areas such as in Gippsland, particularly the Lakes Entrance region, are going to be subject to increasing risk of inundation in the future as sea levels continue to rise, and that will have a big impact on coastal infrastructure and coastal buildings. I hope you can see this graph. Of course, scientists like David and I, we live and breathe graphs. What this graph actually shows is two possible futures. So the little wiggly black line down here is that same graph that David showed right at the beginning of his presentation. So that's the temperature rise that we've had so far. The rest of the graph refers to the potential for what might happen between now and the end of this century. Now the lower band of blue area is what we might expect if we were able to limit greenhouse gases pretty substantially and keep global average temperatures to 2 degrees or below what we experienced in pre-industrial times. That 2 degrees is known as the guardrail above which we expect more serious climate risks. The top band going up, that red band, is the business as usual scenario. So if we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the same rate that's accelerating that we're doing now, that is the sort of range of temperatures that we might expect in the future. Now that's a graph, and as I said, scientists love graphs, but I'd like to make this rather more personal. So the first thing I'll put on the graph is my lifespan. I think I've actually cheated myself a little bit, but you'll get the idea. So I was born in the 1960s, and if I live a sort of average life, that line there refers to the average temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. The next bar, I've got 2 kids that were born in the 1990s, they're teenagers, and assuming they live till they're about 85 or so, that line represents the average temperature that they will experience in their lifespan under a business as usual scenario. Now I don't have grandkids yet, but just in case I do, and if they're born when my kids are about 30 and they live till about 85, they will live beyond the end of this century. And under a business as usual scenario, that's the temperature that they will experience over their lifespan. And of course, what we have to do is work very, very hard, and this is the critical decade in which to do it, to bring that bar down to that 2 degree or below guardrail. So that's why we're here. What we're doing is really talking about our family's future. I'm now going to hand over to Roger to talk a little bit about carbon pricing.
Actually, we might even go back. To go back up the green one? The red one. We might even go back. I joked earlier, when I saw this graph, I wondered why I was on this commission, because I was at university when the 2 professors were born. So I'm going to be signing off well before this becomes an issue. That's why, and I think Jerry might be in the same boat, or nearly. So I'm not quite sure what we're doing on this commission. It might be about our kids and our grandkids. Look, this is a problem. We've known it's a problem for quite some time. But what are we going to do about it? We haven't actually sort of really consistently tackled it as a country. We've talked about it a lot, but what have we done? What can we do? Well, I think we've really got to give business and communities certainty. We've got to reward innovation and investment in a sustained way. One way of doing that, one important way of doing that, is a price, a believable price, and one that you expect is going to stay on pollution, supplemented by wise regulation, because in some areas pricing won't work terribly well, I think, for example, of household appliances, motor vehicles, where regulatory approaches are often more efficient, at minimum energy performance standards, and programs like support for R&D, investment, commercialisation of new technologies where we know the market tends to fail. And we have to, with that certainty, give communities the opportunity to plan for a low carbon future, because this is not just about saying, well, we must go in this direction. Going in this direction has consequences. So how as a community do you move forward in a way without hurting the people who are most vulnerable? Pricing pollution is important because it actually drives behaviour. People say to me, well, why change a price? And my usual response is, well, if you think about it, think about agriculture or think about other areas, we know that price drives investment. We know it drives decisions about what sorts of techniques you're going to use, what sort of products you're going to produce and put to market. And we know that it drives supermarket managers as they make decisions about what to stock, and it sure as hell drives consumers. Just look at what happened to the price and consumption of bananas recently. So price does matter. Size mightn't matter, oh, thank God, but price does. Price does drive behaviour, both in the short term and in the long term. It drives it at each level in the production process. So as costs are passed on, it signals to businesses who are buying high greenhouse intensity products to look for alternatives. And similarly, for households to reduce consumption, for businesses to get more energy smart, for us as individuals to get more energy smart, and so on. But it also drives investment in research and development, and investment in actually deploying technologies once they've been developed. But for that to happen, price has to be believable, it has to be sustainable. The policies have got to be there to stay, and that requires some degree of community understanding and acceptance, and hopefully in the long run, bipartisan commitment to that process. Otherwise, we won't change and we'll be stuck in a period of stasis, where we are left in this position of continuing uncertainty, freeze on sensible investments, and communities worried about where their futures are. Tim.
Thanks very much, Roger. Thank you. Look, I just want to wrap up with two final slides. One which addresses opportunities. I don't know whether you can read that at the top there, but opportunities in low emissions technology. As we've travelled around Australia to the regions, and this is probably about our 12th visit, I think, to regional Australia, it's very clear that there are both threats and opportunities. And in a place like this, where we're acutely aware of the consequences that your community has suffered as a result of privatisation of the electricity generation sector, 15 to 20 years ago, and understand that it's hard to sort of look up from that and see that maybe some opportunities will flow from future changes. But as we've travelled around Australia, we've seen that is undoubtedly the case. There are real opportunities in the transport area, particularly the manufacture of biofuels. We've seen that in places in Queensland where algae is being used, for example, as a biofuel. We've also seen really industries taking advantage of good government policy. Again, in Queensland, in Mackay, we saw a sugar mill that was having a hard time in the international sugar market because the Brazilians control that market, and they really call the shots. Australia, with the appreciating dollar, was finding it very difficult to compete. As a result of the mandated renewable energy target, one sugar mill near Mackay had managed to generate electricity using its waste products. They're generating about 35 megawatts of electricity, about a third the needs for the city of Mackay. And that had given that industry a new future, a stable income into the future. And those sort of opportunities we've seen again and again, either people aspiring to or actually realising in regional Australia. There will be more opportunities, we think, in future, particularly the large-scale generation of electricity. You see concentrator solar infrastructure here. I know that the federal government is looking at funding, I think 1 or 2, I can't remember, of these sorts of power stations at some point in the future. And of course, in terms of built infrastructure, as we go forward, there are great opportunities, particularly in an area like this. We were struck going into Traralgon at the new housing stock going up. Well, the opportunities there for energy efficiency gains and better ratings for buildings is enormous, and that in turn creates its own industries and its own employment as we go forward. So I just encourage you to look at those sort of opportunities here in your community. People often ask what they can do as individuals. And there's a lot of things that you can do. One that we can help you with is to be informed. You've got a lot of expertise here on the stage tonight, myself excluded. These are the real experts. And I really urge you to take full advantage of their presence. I think it's important to be positive about a cleaner future. If you lay back and think, oh, the world's just going to run over me with a steamroller, you're in a more difficult position. Make practical changes at home. We're all going to be facing increased electricity prices in future, as we have in the past. Just practical things that help reduce the costs you outlay are very important, at least for me. I've ended up buying solar panels because I didn't want to be paying a power generator my whole life for the electricity I use. And also acts of leadership, talking to other people, doing things creative at work or school. The communities that are best prepared for this coming change, which we all think is inevitable, this global shift to a clean energy future, are those communities that have worked together to pre-position themselves to take full advantage of the opportunities that will come from this change. The Illawarra region in New South Wales is a classic example of that. They had enormous redundancies in the 1980s as a result of this crisis in the steel industry. They vowed never to go through that sort of trauma again. And up there we've seen local councils, regional institutes of higher education, unions, and the community as a whole working together to pre-position themselves for the benefits, the opportunities that will come from this change. So I can only urge you on to say leadership is important, and I'm sure that this community has every bit as much potential as others we've visited around Australia to show that sort of leadership. Well, I think that's enough from us now. We really want to hear from you, and I'll hand over to Rob to moderate questions from the audience.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Commissioners. We now do have, well, a good 45 or 50 minutes for you to ask questions of the Commission. A number of you have pre-registered questions. When you registered to attend this event, we're going to be using a mix of those pre-registered questions and questions from the floor tonight. I do ask that your questions be focused and as brief as possible. 20 or 30 seconds is pretty good, and we ask you to do that so that we can get as many questions in as possible. So please don't make lengthy statements. Just keep the short questions. If you do make lengthy statements, I'll ask you to stop and ask your question, because that's my job tonight. Now, the Commission does seek to conduct this session with mutual respect and courtesy, so I ask that you participate in the same way that the Commissioners will. So, who has a question? Gentleman there in the red jacket.
Thank you. Burning brown coal and producing CO2, then capturing it and turning it into algae just to burn it, is putting that same CO2, which is fossil CO2, into the air. How's that really helping the environment, which seems to be something our economists are telling us to do? Thank you.
Can we have two cracks at this? I might say something and Tim might as well. You're absolutely right. But what it does do is actually use that 1 unit of CO2 emissions to do more work than would have otherwise occurred if it had been simply vented. But fundamentally, there is still a problem that we're taking some carbon out of the fixed sequestered system and releasing it into the carbon cycle. And that is potentially increasing the problem to the extent that we then need to enhance carbon absorption or uptake. But if it does more work, it means that you're displacing another carbon emission that would otherwise have occurred. So it is helpful at the margin. It can be significantly helpful, but it's not the total solution to the problem.
Do you want to add, Tim?
I think that what Roger said is absolutely right, and all I can do is give you an analogy to the situation that, you know, the pool of carbon that cycles through the biosphere or the living part of the planet, you can think of as a bathtub filled with water, and you know, there's a tap running at a certain rate at one end and a plug hole at the other end of the bath, and the outflow is perfectly balanced with the inflow. As we dig up fossil fuels, it's the equivalent of opening the faucet of the tap so that we're getting more water in. Eventually the bathtub will overflow. Now, using that carbon that we're putting in to great efficiency helps slow the degree to which the faucet's opened, but it still ultimately leaves us with a problem.
Gentleman here.
Hello, my name is John Wisher from Churchill. I live here 10 years. And I got here a report on the risk and impacts of a potential future decline in oil production. Now, that's a British report by the British Department of Energy and Climate Change. And they argue for a low carbon economy on the basis of peak oil, not on global warming.
There's a good question for Jerry. Peak oil, Jerry, the British Department of...
Yeah, I think there is a time in the future when oil physical production will peak. It's still an open debate as to whether it'll peak because of peak demand or peak supply. For example, the US, which is the biggest oil user in the world, demand has peaked there already. So the growth in demand is coming from the developing world. It's certainly peaked in Europe. I think it will happen at some stage in the future. But oil, for the last 40 years, there's been 40 years of oil at today's rate. So we've managed to find, through improvement in technology and oil finds, enough oil to replace what we use each year for the last 40 years. So it will happen at some stage in the future, but this is not the thing that's going to drive the response to climate change. There are issues about energy security because a lot of that oil is in more difficult to, either politically more difficult or technologically more difficult to achieve. But it's not going to be peak oil, I suspect, that's going to drive these activities or needs to drive these activities in the short term.
The gentleman on the side.
I submitted this when I registered, so I hope I don't confuse your system there. At least words to this effect.
If you let me know your name, I'll know which one you are.
Paul Strickland. And this is probably a more economically based question. There is a suggestion that the process of adding a price to pollution is going to result in what is effectively a derivatives kind of market, because it's not a direct product. The GFC would seem to have given us a very bad experience of folks running derivative markets. Why should we not expect a similar, at least potential, problem from this kind of derivatives market?
Okay. That's a very good question. The GFC has given markets, all markets, a bad name in some respects. But the previous 5 centuries also demonstrated that markets are fundamental to our improved economic conditions. They've actually contributed enormously. But markets need to be well run and well regulated. The derivatives market that saw the GFC was one that had neither of those characteristics. We were producing exotic products that no one understood, least of all those who were producing them sometimes, and certainly not those who were buying them. If we look at the carbon market, it is going to be quite critical to make sure that that market is well regulated. We know that we can do that domestically. We absolutely know that that's the case. We have good metrics. We're only talking about a relatively small number of companies that are involved here. They're companies that publish annual reports, that provide statistics to the tax office and to everybody else consistently. So, and they've been reporting their carbon pollution production, or their CO2, I'd rather call it CO2 pollution, for quite some years, or greenhouse pollution. Now, if, and I think we will and should, progressively accept carbon credits from other countries, we have to be equally rigorous. The opportunity for corruption is only there to the extent that we allow it. So if we set the right sorts of standards, if we require the right sort of metrication and auditing, there is not the risk of running the GFC type scandal on a large scale. There will be scams, and there will be people who corrupt the system, but that happens even with tax now. There are people who don't pay their GST or don't pay their income tax, and you've just got to chase the buggers and catch them.
Just to add to that, I think we're also well served by the reality that there are trading schemes operating, and there's been a lot of learnings. For example, the European scheme has been much maligned in its early days, but the learnings from that have been tremendous, and so we're seeing the learnings from those flow through, so that when the reality hits and Australia does have a price on carbon and emissions trading scheme, then we will know how to regulate it better than perhaps we would have if we'd started out full flight 10 years ago.
Tim, I know you've been to Japan recently, and Susanna, I think, has been to Germany, and we've had a number of international visitors in Australia coming to observe where we're moving to. Can you give us a sense of what the international playing field looks like now?
Sure. Well, look, I might start and then hand to Roger, who knows China particularly well, and Susanna, who knows Europe. But look, we had 5 international visitors here in Australia 2 weeks ago, and they were from California, India, China, Europe. And it was fascinating to see what was developing, because we heard from the Californians that their emissions trading scheme was on track to open next year. I think the projected carbon price was around $30 a tonne, maybe a little bit higher. We heard from India that in the medium term their future really had to be solar or renewables. There was very few options. They will continue to burn coal into the future, but that they really need to make a transition to renewables mid-century or before because of the constraints in their economy. I'll let Roger talk about China. One of the things I saw on my trip to Japan recently that astonished me was just some of the technological developments that have gone on. Over the last year or so, Sanyo, now taken over by Panasonic, have produced the world's most efficient solar panel. And they told me that next year that solar panel will be producing electricity at a price equivalent of electricity purchased from the grid in New South Wales. So there are real changes in terms of cost of these panels as well as efficiency. They were also developing batteries that were just enormous in their potential to store energy in a very small area and with not much weight. I saw a 1.5 kilowatt battery, quite a very powerful battery, about as big as my DVD player at home. And these are actually being used now in Japan. They were also developing fuel cell technologies that allowed for the burning of natural gas very efficiently to produce electricity. And using those 3 technologies, Panasonic were redeveloping one of their old factory sites on about 50 acres with 1,000 housing units on it, and using fuel cells, batteries and these solar panels. They were going to generate enough electricity for that community to be entirely standalone. So all of its electrical needs, all of its transport needs coming from that small site. And that just told me really that these technologies are developing very, very quickly, getting cheaper by the year, and are going to be very competitive in the near future.
The reason Tim's asked me to talk about China is that done quite a bit of work in China. When I retired, the Chinese government, not because I retired, but timing was just coincidental, asked the Australian government to nominate an independent expert to join the Premier's International Advisory Committee on Environment and Development. And Alexander Downer was kind enough to put my name forward, and the Chinese government accepted it. So since then, which was nearly 7 years ago, I've met every year with the Chinese Premier, and the Council has worked with our Chinese official colleagues and research colleagues and industry colleagues to produce advice for the Chinese government. So I've seen them work through the development of the 12th five-year plan and the implementation of the 11th five-year plan. And they put lowering the carbon content of the Chinese economy very high on their agenda. Now, this will be an intensity target, but a 45% reduction by 2020 in their carbon intensity. If you look at that target, and the ANU professors Yotso and Stern have done a very good paper comparing this in terms of its departure from business as usual with the US and with Europe. And it is equally challenging. So it's hard work. So what are they doing? They are embracing cleaner coal technologies. So yes, they're building lots of thermal power stations because there's no choice, lots of coal-fired power stations, but they're ultra-supercritical at least. A lot of them are closed cycle. There's a lot of combined heat and power. So their efficiency levels compared with our power stations are enormously high. But they're pushing very hard on renewables, nuclear, and gas as a transitional fuel as well. And they will account for nearly half of the world's renewable investment in the next year or so. And you ask them why they're doing that, because this is the future, and China is determined to be part of the future. And that investment, $1.3 billion per annum, is driving the real cost of these technologies down. Solar panel prices have fallen spectacularly since China's been engaged, as has wind power, and not an issue necessarily for Australia, but you would expect nuclear prices to fall as well as they develop their fleet of nuclear power stations. This, looking at it in a different way, provides Australia with opportunities in high tech and in intellectual property that are quite enormous, and which could be quite a useful hedging strategy for our heavy reliance on resource exports to China, because China will be reducing its resource imports over the long term, and we need to have something to stand in that place. The Chinese solar industry is built on Australian IP that the University of New South Wales sold for what, $160,000, and solar billionaires have grown from that in China. So we've got to be more clever about this and engage with those sorts of opportunities. Don't let anybody tell you that China's doing nothing.
Could I just ask you, we also heard about emissions trading schemes in China, which I think is important.
They'll start an emissions trading scheme in 2013 on a trial basis, as early as 2013 and definitely by 2015. It's only going to involve 6 cities and 4 provinces, but guess how many people that is? That's 250 million people approximately, and it would be, if you viewed it as a separate economy, well and truly in the G12, you know, the top 12 economies. And while we're talking about it, California and the west coast of Canada, the west coast of the US and Canada, which are also will be actively engaging in emissions trading, as is as are the East Coast states by 2015, or 2013 in California's case. They're in the top 8 if they were independent economies. These are serious people doing serious things, and they are committed to what they see the real long-term future as being.
The conversation is very pertinent to my question. I wanted to put to you that in 1989 the SECV commissioned and published a very comprehensive plan on how this state intended managing greenhouse gas emissions. And had the SEC still been around, Hazelwood Power Station would certainly have been closed by now. Given that privatisation saw all of those plans put in the bin, has the Climate Commission done any work on identifying those other excesses of privatisation and how they have impeded the ability of the state to manage our energy systems and have had a very detrimental impact on the environment and on how we handle the environmental imperative?
Tim, you mentioned this in passing in your opening.
Yeah, look, I did. We haven't done any work specifically on that area. It's probably on the edges of our purview, really. But we are acutely aware of the sort of legacy issues around these sort of changes and the ongoing struggles in places like New South Wales, indeed, to come to terms with this. But Roger,
Can I say that public ownership doesn't guarantee good environmental outcomes. You only had to look at the performance of most of Eastern Europe, the impact that had both from the viewpoint of global warming, but also simply from the impact it was having because of acid rain on European forests and lakes. So government ownership and private ownership can both fail to deliver environmental outcomes. What's key is actually having environmental objectives and incentives and regulatory frameworks which drive us to achieve them.
My name's Steb Fisher. I did some solar energy research in the 1970s and then I went to work for BP for 11 years, so I feel some affinity with the panel. I want to ask a question which is a bit radical and even takes us way further than I think some of the proposals so far. And it's a thought experiment. If we were to snap our fingers and overnight convert all energy production from non-renewables to renewables, genuine renewables, solar, wind, waves, would we still, all other things being equal, wreck the world's ecosystems? I've obviously answered that question, but I'd be very interested in your answers.
Look, I'll hand over to David for this one, because that really is in part a science question. I'll let you go first, Dave, then I'll come in at the end, because there's so
sure. So, if I understand the question as you phrased it, it's to snap our fingers and essentially reduce the world's human-related emissions of greenhouse gases essentially to zero very quickly. And what that does, because we know how much greenhouse gases, how much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is essentially set to zero the human emissions and then allows natural processes to very slowly remove them, because we know the timescales for that removal. We can estimate from climate models, from understanding the natural systems, the natural processes for removal of carbon dioxide, what temperature we would experience, and we already have enough carbon dioxide and long-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to lead to warming at about that 2-degree guardrail level that Leslie talked about earlier. So the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, if we were to switch, as you said, flicker, switch and turn everything off to renewable energies, would lead to about 2 degrees of warming. We haven't seen that already because of the slow response of the climate system and because some of the warming is masked by the release of particles from industrial activity into the atmosphere. But about 2 degrees, that is going to have impacts on ecosystems, but it's already been assessed as being a reasonable level to avoid the worst dangerous impacts from climate change. And in terms of ecosystem impacts, I'm not the best person to talk about, and that's either Leslie or Tim.
Look, even 2 degrees is pretty serious for a lot of things. So, for example, coral reefs, we hear a lot about bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Coral reefs can bleach if they get to 1 or 2 degrees above their long-term summer maximum temperature for more than a few days or weeks. And then the corals spit out their algae and they bleach and they die. So even 2 degrees over relatively short periods of time is dangerous for some things. And the one thing we know for sure about species and climate change is that every species is going to be affected differently. Some species will be advantaged by warming if they're currently limited by cold, for example, but many species will be disadvantaged. We've probably already had species climate change related extinctions both here and elsewhere, and one of the saddest things about climate change in the future is that rate of species extinction will almost certainly accelerate. But even 2 degrees is dangerous for a lot of things. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out one thing which I wasn't sure you were going to cover, but no one can predict the future. So when we think about these impacts, we're dealing with probabilities. So will 2 degrees of warming destabilise Earth's ecosystems or not? And we can only take a probabilistic approach to that. But what we do know is that the higher the ultimate temperature, the greater the probability, that we will have serious impacts. So the fact that we have already built in a certain degree of warming is not an argument for complacency or despair or anything else. We know that we need to limit the risk, and that's the approach I think we need to take to this, is to say we know we've got a problem, we know there's already quite a lot of inertia built into the system, but that's no reason for inaction. We need to limit the risk to us and future generations by getting that trajectory pointing downwards as quickly as we can.
And in fact, that's why this decade is the critical decade, because the longer we continue greenhouse gas emissions, the higher is the warming and the greater the probability of dangerous impacts. So the decisions we make this decade determine the trajectory of warming and the level at which that warming might eventually stabilise. But that's why the critical decade is this decade in terms of making decisions about reducing emissions.
Let's take another question. The gentleman in the blue jacket.
I'm curious about, facts are very much more powerful than opinions, and so recently I cottoned onto the fact that Australia is already close to being the worst for per capita emissions, except for a few little oil chieftains in the Middle East. But that's only on GHGs within the country, and so it doesn't include exports. So I did a bit of wiki searching, and so if we get some benefit from those exports, we're twice as bad as we are on domestic burning. And has anybody got any estimates for greenhouse gases, for LNG, and otherwise, what do you think about the Minister's plans to export brown coal from Hastings? Are we going in the right direction or what?
Look, perhaps I'll have a crack at this. There are 2 ways of looking at accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. You can look at where those emissions are produced, and then let each of the polluting countries attempt to drive their production, the pollutants, down. Or you can look at where they're consumed, because we export LNG, perhaps it goes to China, perhaps it's used to fire an aluminium smelter. Then, of course, it finds its way into automobiles manufactured and consumed in Germany or in the US. And the beneficiaries of the carbon production might be thought to be the rich countries who are consuming it. So you could look at a consumption model as well. The difficulty with the consumption model is that if you're going to do it with elegance, it's like a GST that you would have to track all the way through the system, and that's not really practical. If you don't track it through the system, but you average in some sort of way, for example, you just apply your own carbon intensity to all imports, then it doesn't provide the sort of signal that you need to lead a China, for example, to choose more carbon efficient rather than less carbon efficient technologies. So the point you make is a really good one. There are lots of ways of doing the accounting. The world is settled on the production way because it's probably the most practical.
I think just, another point to make on that is that we are, with the exception of some small sheikdoms, we are the highest per capita emitter of CO2. We are, we're not in the same league as China or the US, but we are in the second tier. We're sort of similar size to France in absolute terms, and close to the UK. So for those reasons, it is untenable for Australia to sit back and wait and see what happens, rather than sort of being moving in line with at least moving in line with the pack, which is where I think both political parties aspire to be by 2020. Yeah.
Lady here.
Yeah, just following up on that, I think obviously what you're saying is correct. It is the critical decade, and yet the level of discussion is still pretty appalling, despite all your efforts and lots of other people's efforts, the Youth Coalition on Climate Change being just one example. So I want to, thank you for all the hard work you're doing, but even if you go to 1,000 community meetings and put lots of things on the web, it's pretty hard to counter the shock jock stuff and the fear and the negativity and the hate campaigns, which I think are pretty scary stuff. Obviously we need a bipartisan approach. We're a fair way from that, and you probably can't talk much about that. And you're all in there for the long haul, and I think lots of people are, but I suppose it's just about where we find some hope to counter the pretty negative, destructive stuff that's going on right now.
Is this a Susanna question? Is this a communications issue,
It is a communications question, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I'll start, because it's probably, I think all of us have something we can say on that. Well, look, first of all, I think it's incredibly important that we don't see the debate that's happening in the media as being representative of the whole community. In fact, we know that's not the case. And what tends to happen is, when you do have this sort of extreme elements that come out in blogs and in the media, and let's face it, I mean, the media is, it tends to focus on conflict and political polarisation rather than general community consensus. So we have to make sure that we don't get too bogged down in that and too depressed by it. Because it is, it can be quite, I think, depressing if you follow that argument or that debate going on in the media all the time. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is, there's sort of two things here. One is, we do have to keep coming back to the science and reminding ourselves why we're going through this pain. I mean, it's quite legitimate for people to be debating how we respond to climate change. And it's perfectly understandable that people do that. But we do have to keep on coming back to the science and reminding ourselves, why is it that we're doing this? Why do we have to go through this? The other thing I think that's incredibly important is that we also do focus on the opportunities. And that's one of the things I found when I was in Germany, is that I felt that actually they'd moved on from this debate quite some time ago. They have been living with an emissions trading scheme now since 2005, as all European countries have. And, there is a sense of optimism there. And even for those people who don't necessarily know whether they understand the science or whether they agree that the science is human-induced, they see that alternative green energy is a powerful and positive move for them. And there is a very, very strong positive feeling about green energy and about moving forward. So I think it's, and that's one of the things that we find as we move around the country, is that, once you start actually looking at what companies, individuals, communities, whether it's the Hepburn Community Wind Farm through to the Mackay sugar industry, and there's so many wonderful examples that you actually don't hear about in the media. And that's partly because you might hear about them locally, but the media doesn't tend to focus on these positive stories. And yet there's a lot out there. And what we find is that when we start talking about those, that people feel, actually, yeah, we can find that fighting spirit, and we can do this. And there are lots of things that we can do. It's not just about a carbon tax, and there's just so much that you can do.
Can I just
another comment? Yep.
Add very briefly. I mean, I was terribly depressed the other day. I was reading Plato's philosophy just for quite a several reasons.
To cheer you up.
And in it he made it, as you do. Well, it's actually quite interesting what he had to say. But he had this wonderful comment in there. He said most people work from opinion. He said, it's only the gods and a very few human beings who are given the gift of being able to apply their intelligence to observations to come to their own conclusions. And that was 2,500 years ago in Greece. And I thought, my God, nothing much has changed in human nature over that time. But the one thing that has changed is, I think with this new social media, people are licensed now or feel able on the internet to be very rude to other people and very bigoted in their views, and they put things on the internet that they would never in a million years say publicly to your face. And I think we as a society need to censure that. We need to tell them that they're actually out of line when people do that, whether it's online, on the internet, or whether it is face to face. And we need to somehow bring a more civil aspect to this debate. Otherwise, we'll simply descend into a really nasty mudslinging and opinion-slinging world. And when you place on top of that the denigration of expert advice, things look pretty toxic.
Now, I have to be cautious. Thank you. I need to be cautious with our time now, and I need to be very ecumenical on the floor here. So, gentleman there, and then I want the next microphone to go to the gentleman. Put your hand up high, sir. That one for next. Thank you.
Ray Asprey from Phillip Island. At this time, we find the coalition making the point that the majority don't want the carbon tax. Now, I've been involved in a number of surveys with my local climate change group, and I'm astounded that they're probably right that the majority don't want it, but the reason is they're not very well informed. I'd like to know what the Commission is doing to educate the masses, because we're not going to have effective legislation until the masses know, what effect carbon dioxide is having on the planet.
It's another communications question, but firstly, go to the website. There's some really good stuff on the website. That's my first chance to plug the Climate Commission website. There's some very good material there, but let's go beyond that. Give us some other bright ideas. How are we going to... It's a big job. Leslie, Susanna already mentioned. Huge task.
Maybe just another way into it. A lot of the answers to surveys depend on what the question is. And anything with tax in it doesn't seem to resonate particularly well. But if you actually look at what the level of consensus there is out there, it is actually quite extraordinary, and it certainly doesn't bear recognition with the way you'd see things portrayed, for example, in some of the media. But there is a huge amount of business support for action on climate change. This is big business and small business. There's debate about exactly what it should be, but there's a lot of support for a market-based mechanism to drive this. Between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, you've got an agreement on a 2020 goal. It's that goal that sets the cost of doing this. It's not the mechanism. The mechanism will then prove, what is the most efficient way to do it. So there are, there's probably a lot more agreement out there than you'd actually see in the way that it's being portrayed at times. So you can be quite positive about this at times, but depends on your perception.
Now, sir, you've been waiting a long time.
There are a lot of interesting things going on, technological developments and so on, but in terms of large-scale commercial energy production, is there really any alternative to deal with greenhouse in Australia other than the greatly expanded use of natural gas or nuclear energy? And a lot of people aren't very keen on that for various reasons. And just a small comment to you, Tim. The question of false hopes. You raised my hopes about 4 or 5 years ago in the comments in the ABC about geothermal. Well, let's hope it happens, but it certainly hasn't happened yet, has it?
No, it's been much slower than I would have liked, and most other people would have liked. I guess as an investor in geodynamics, I'll be rewarded in heaven, but it doesn't appear that the reward will come any much before that. Well, you never know, but But look, potentially geothermal is being developed overseas. There are areas where it's going ahead. In Java, there's investment by an Australian company and an Indian company in a geothermal plant. And I don't think we should lose hope in any of these technologies. Individual companies may come and go, but the technology itself, is likely to play some sort of role. And I say that because we know there's no silver bullet to any of this. Yeah, there's a lot of silver buckshot. There'll be a lot of niche aspects for energy, But I should really hand over to those who know the natural gas sector.
I want Leslie to repeat. I know the comment you heard, Leslie, at a recent conference about the equivalence of the Australian and the German opportunity in solar. It's a useful statistic to share.
Sure. Some of us went to a conference in Melbourne a couple of months ago called Australia Above 4 Degrees, and those of us that were asked to speak were asked to imagine for our particular area of expertise what it would be like to be in Australia that was above 4 degrees. So I spoke about ecosystems above 4 degrees, etc. And as you can imagine, a conference like that was actually pretty depressing 3 days. And we got to the end of the 3 days, most of us ready to slash our wrist by that point. And then the very last talk on the last day, and I think David was there, was a guy from Melbourne, from the Sustainability Institute, who got up to give his talk and waved this bit of plastic in the air. And we thought, what the hell's he doing? And he said, see what I'm holding? This is a solar cell, and I printed it on my printer. And he began to speak about some of the amazing solar technology being developed in Melbourne. There's another company in Wollongong that are competing. They're doing things like making solar cells on their printers. There's another company in the UK that are making solar cells that are embedded in roof tiles. So, you know, very soon you're going to be able to tile your roof with solar cells. You know, the technology, as Tim mentioned earlier, the technology developing here and elsewhere is really accelerating, and I think we have to all hold on to that hope that technology will come to the rescue. That's what we're clinging on to, I think.
The one I was trying to draw out of you was the comment that Germany is one of the great nations in solar.
Oh yes, okay. So at the same conference, our German speaker, John Schellenhuber, is one of the best-known climate scientists in the world, indicated to us that the place in Australia that has the worst solar radiation is on the west coast of Tasmania, and there's more solar radiation there than the best place in Germany. Yet Germany is moving incredibly quickly towards having solar energy as their main source of energy. So heavens, if Germany can do it with far less solar radiation than anywhere else in Australia, you know, surely we can do that too.
Alan Scarlett, a common view I think that's held in this region and also in Victoria about our economy is that we need coal-powered electricity generation to provide baseload that underpins our manufacturing industry. Can you paint a scenario around how you could actually continue manufacturing with reliable baseload power generation?
Take that. Either Roger or Jerry, perhaps.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Sorry, I've got to use this one. I moved so much that I've destroyed my other microphone. I clearly wouldn't be a Madonna. Probably a few reasons for that. Just last week, we had Linda Adams, who was the very recently retired Secretary of the EPA in California. California will be deploying quite shortly its first solar thermal baseload power station. So this is a solar power station which actually uses the power it generates. It's stored so that it can actually release that through the night. But we can move, and we probably will, as a transitional fuel to closed cycle gas baseload power stations. These are certainly used elsewhere in the world. There are other possibilities, and indeed the other Alan Jones, that is not the one who's on the radio, but the one who changed the energy profile of London, or a large borough of London, and who's now advising Sydney, has argued very strongly that you don't necessarily need to have large baseload, huge mega power stations, but distributed power might well be part of the way of the future. But I think these are all options that need to be there in the market, and we need to have the incentive to actually have the tension and the competition to see which is commercially deployable progressively over time.
Any other comments about the potential of renewables to provide baseload, or we move on? The Chief Commissioner has just given me a couple more minutes for some extra questions. Now this gentleman here.
Question before, but this is not that question. In relation to the debate on human-induced climate change, it'll create debate for years to come and not much will happen. We've got wet politics, so one party says it is and it isn't. So we can circumnavigate that, I think, by putting forward the benefits of moving to a renewable energy future by saying that our energy security is paramount. If we don't have to import oil from Iraq or Libya or any of those nations where there's war and all sorts of despots, if we can put the benefits of clean environment due to lack of heavy pollutants in the environment that we breathe daily in the Latrobe Valley and in Gippsland, and also the economic benefits of moving to a renewable energy future by the amount of jobs we would create by implementing new technologies and replacing the old technologies. So those three things could get us across the line and circumnavigate the debate as whether it's human-induced or what. Just move towards just sell the positives and forget about the debate on fighting over it.
So let me briefly answer that, because I agree with all your comments about renewable energies and opportunities. They are absolutely correct. But I actually don't agree with your premise, because in fact both political parties in Victoria, all political parties at the federal level, accept that the climate is changing and that human emissions of greenhouse gases are the major contributing factor. So there isn't in fact a political debate in Australia about the science of climate change. The political parties at federal and at state level accept it. So you're right though that there are lots and lots of opportunities to frame the response to climate change as well as energy independence and renewable energies in terms of seizing the opportunities that exist in the Latrobe Valley and throughout Australia in terms of renewable energy opportunities.
I'd just like to make one other comment, because as I think Tim mentioned before, there is no silver bullet for this, but it's pretty clear as you go along that we must try and find the most efficient way of actually achieving the goal in the future, and so there are lots of regulatory things you can do, and one that comes to mind, for example, on the back of energy security in the US, is this mad drive to biofuels, first generation biofuels, eating into the food chain, not economic except when distorted by the mandates that they do, and that's probably the wrong thing to do. So we need to be very careful about some of the mechanisms we could use to achieve an outcome, because it may have a negative effect actually at the end of the day.
And Rod, I have your question here. We've had lots from the floor, but your question, like the others that were pre-registered, we'll endeavour to answer on the website, so perhaps there'll be an answer there shortly. Now there's a young lady in the middle, right there.
My name's Victoria. I'm a student here at Monash University. My question relates mainly to communications. I think you could probably count on one or two hands the number of people here who are under the age of 30 tonight. And considering that climate change is going to affect our generation the most, I think a lot of young people have become really disengaged with the debate because we feel as though nothing's being done and that nobody is listening to us. How do you think we can best engage with people of my age and my generation to keep the movement going?
Susanna?
Just very briefly, and then I'll hand over to you. Is Amanda Mackenzie in the room here? Where is she? Good. Amanda is the person who founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. There's now 60,000 people in that organisation, all under 27, I think it is. I don't know, Amanda, would you like to just say a word or two about empowering young people? Maybe we could take the microphone over if she's...
Okay, Tim. As Tim mentioned, I did previously work at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and really what we found consistently was that young people are really passionate about this issue. There's definitely no debate amongst young people that there's an issue of sustainability, there's an issue of climate change, and there's something that needs to be addressed for our generation and generations to come. So I think to go to the question about how best to engage young people, I think at the moment, with a pretty negative political environment, is creating opportunities for communities to come together to create change locally. So whether that's in your school, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's at the university, actually creating change in those locations, I think, is really powerful, and a powerful way of bringing the community together around that.
Thanks, Amanda. Now, Tim, I've left you about precisely 2 minutes to sum up, unless you want to hear briefly from Susanna. You're the boss here. You're running the schedule.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, look, I was just going to say, when we were in Western Australia, we also met a group of kids belonging to an organisation that was actually set up by a high school boy called Millennium Kids. And they're really quite proactive, and they're really thinking quite holistically about this. It's not just about greenhouse gases, it's really about the environment and about the future that they're moving into. And I think, you know, kids really have an incredible amount of power to influence their own parents as well. So I really think that should be a focus.
Now, we want to give you a chance to get away precisely at 7, so I want to give Tim now a chance to just make some concluding comments, and I'll just come back and make sure you have an further opportunity to have your questions answered.
Thanks, Rob. And look, could I thank you all for being here this evening? People from as far away as Phillip Island. It's really heartening that you made the trip, so thank you very much. And could I say I'm not at all dismayed at the number of grey heads in the audience, mine included. You people are the community leaders, you're our elders, and to see you in the audience gives me great heart, it really does, because I know that you will go away from this evening and discuss the sort of things you heard if we've done our job properly. And that's incredibly important, because you as the community elders will really be listened to with this. I wish you the very best with doing that, because we are in a period of pretty profound transition, and communities that are well organised and well prepared for the changes ahead are those that are going to prosper. I really hope that the Latrobe Valley is one of those communities, and from what we've seen today, I think you've got the potential to be so, but there's more work to be done yet, and if we can help you with the Commission, either through our website or whatever else, we'd be delighted to oblige. So thank you once more for being here, and all the very best for the future. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you all to the Climate Commission's community conversation here in the Latrobe Valley. The Commissioners present with us tonight, our Chief Commissioner, nationally acclaimed scientist, writer, conservationist and former Australian of the Year, Professor Tim Flannery, Professor Leslie Hughes, who's head of the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie University, who's in fact in the middle. I'll go in order so that you can know who I'm talking about. Next, the other lady on the right-hand side, Dr. Susanna Elliott, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Science Media Centre. At the far end, Mr. Roger Beale, Executive Director of Economics and Policy at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I've forgotten Jerry Houston in the middle, who's the recently retired President of BP Australia. The Commissioners are also joined this evening by a special guest, Professor David Carolli, who's sitting next to Tim Flannery. One of the Commissioners, Professor Will Stephan, is unable to be with us tonight, and Professor Carolli has been invited to attend as a member of the Commission's Science Advisory Panel. David's a leading expert in climate variability and climate change, including interannual climate variations due to the El Niño Southern Oscillation and weather extremes. Before we start this evening, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gunai-Kurnai people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to elders from other communities who may be here tonight joining us. My name's Rob Gell. I'm an environmental and earth scientist. I have had a career in the media, and I'm a practicing environmental communication consultant. I'm also the National President of Greening Australia, a member of the Victorian Coastal Council, and I interestingly chair a UNESCO biosphere at Western Port, just across to our east. And I hope that I'll be able to facilitate this evening's discussions faithfully. The aim of tonight is very much, and I've had the pleasure of facilitating the very first Climate Commission conversation in Geelong, and they are very much designed to be a conversation. The Commissioners are here to listen as well as to share some of their knowledge and their experiences. And they've been touring around the valley just these last couple of days, and I believe are here tomorrow again. You'll hear from them on what they've heard and seen in the Latrobe Valley, and you'll also have plenty of time to ask them questions. To begin, may I introduce Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. Professor Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was named Australian of the Year in 2007 and is currently the Panasonic Chair in Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. He's had a range of academic positions. He's been the Director of the South Australian Museum. He's been Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum and the Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, for that great introduction. And I'd like to thank Gippsland campus of Monash University as well for hosting us this evening. It's really, really good to be here. In fact, it's good for me to be back in the Latrobe Valley because my very first paid job ever was at Morwell, believe it or not. I was a young student at the Museum of Victoria, and the mining operations at the Morwell coal mine had revealed some fire pits, ancient fire pits that had the skeletons of some extinct kangaroos in them. And those kangaroos happened to be what I was studying. So I was paid, I think it was $250 or something, which seemed like a fortune to me, to assist with the articulation of the skeletons that were eventually displayed in the visitors centre at the Morwell coal mine. I don't know whether they're still there, but I'd love to hear if anyone's seen them recently. It was a great experience, and they were great employers. I was very pleased to work with them. I want to just have a few words about the Climate Commission and what we do. The Climate Commission itself resulted from an election promise at the last election by the Gillard government. And we are tasked with getting out among the Australian community and entering into dialogue with people about all aspects of climate change, whether it be the science, economic issues around climate change, or what's happening internationally. We're independent of government, and we really value our independence greatly for a number of reasons. So we don't, for example, take direction from the minister, although we're funded by the government, we are independent of it. We prefer to work in a bipartisan way, and our reports that we produce periodically reflect that. The first report that we have released on the science of climate change was released in May this year into the Australian Federal Parliament. Received bipartisan support from both sides, politics, Liberal and Labor Party, both acknowledged that report as the basis upon which we're acting to deal with the climate problem. So we hope to work in that way as we go on. We really have three sorts of products, if you want. One is our website, and I encourage you all to go onto the website if you're interested in the work of the Commission and what we've heard around Australia, and see what you can find out there. We also have reports, as I mentioned, the science report called The Critical Decade, being our major report so far. And we also conduct community visits, and today is a good example of that. We've been around the traps today. We've been down to meet your mayor and various other councillors. We've been off to a union office here at the Hazelwood Power Station. Tomorrow we're going to a business breakfast, and we'll visit a high school and do a few other things. And of course this evening is your chance in the community to take advantage of the presence of the Commission and ask our Commissioners any questions that you like. We take a long-term view of the climate issue. For us, we know that this issue will be with the Australian community for decades to come, and that in a democracy, the only way really to make progress in dealing with a problem like this is to have a populace that understands some of the key issues. So that's what we see as our role. We don't give opinions on policy, government policy or opposition policy, although we can talk about, in general, the sort of approaches that are desirable. And we do that because we give away the power to comment on policy, because we want to retain the authority to be seen as an independent source of high quality information. We don't want to get stuck into the opinion of politics. We want to provide the Australian public with the information that you require and others require in order to come to their own conclusions about the problems that we face in terms of climate change. I'd like to just turn to our commissioners now, just so you get to know them a little bit personally rather than just people on the stage, and give them just a couple of minutes each to tell their own story about why they're here and how they got interested in climate science and what they've done. And at the end of that, David Carrolly, who's sitting on my immediate left there, will begin a very brief presentation on climate science. We'll all have a word to say about that, or 3 or 4 of us will have a word to say about that, and then we'll turn the night over to you to ask questions. So bear with us for a bit longer. Soon we'll be quiet and we'll be hearing from you. But I'd like to now start with David perhaps, and could give us just a minute or two on how we got to be what he's doing today.
Sure, Tim, and it's a pleasure for me to be here in Gippsland again. I first got interested in climate science and climate variability, in fact, while skiing in the Victorian Alps, just a little bit north of here, and used to go out in the countryside and was amazed at the wind patterns and the clouds forming over the mountains. That then developed into graduate study on climate variability, and in the 1980s, mid-1980s, I started to look at climate variability and climate change. I thought I had a clever idea that would allow me, by analysing climate data, to show that increasing greenhouse gases were not causing the observed changes in the climate. And the more and more I looked at the data, I found that the patterns of observed changes were agreeing with the expected changes due to increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. My first paper on that subject was published in 1987, now 24 years ago. So I've been involved in climate science and climate variability and climate change for a number of years.
I'm Leslie Hughes. I'm an ecologist. I got interested in climate change after doing my PhD, which was actually on ant behaviour, and after following ants around the bush for about 4 years, I'd actually got a bit sick of that and was looking for something else to do. And so my PhD supervisor at the time said, you know, this was 20 years ago, climate change might be an interesting topic. And I thought, yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So I did get involved in it then, and I've been involved in it ever since, and what I've been studying is the potential impact of climate change on species and ecosystems. And what I found is that once you get into studying, doing research on climate change like David, it's very difficult to leave it alone then, because it becomes so important in your life that you can't give it away. So I guess I'm on the Commission because I've been studying climate change impacts for a very long time. The reason, however, I accepted the invitation is simply because I'm a parent, and what matters to me most is the state of the planet that I'll leave to my children.
Jerry Houston. Until recently I was head of BP in this region, and I've been an oil man for well, virtually all of my working life. I've worked with BP for nearly 35 years. So it seems a little bit incongruous that, you know, I should be here you know, talking about climate change, but many of you may or may not be aware that BP globally was one of the first big energy companies, in fact I think the first big energy company to come out and say there's a significant business risk here. You know, from what you hear from the science, this is something that we should actually look at very seriously and become part of the solution and not be part of the perceived as part of the problem. And you know, sort of the inspirational leadership from John Brown at the time meant that, you know, around the world we got engaged in the dialogue with, you know, all of the players in the game on climate change. So yeah, I've been